talk is from Julia Yesberg, also from UCL, and she's going to be talking about support for police powers during the lockdown period. Over to you, Julia.
Thank you. Okay, thank you very much, Ben, and thank you everyone for joining us today. So my talk is about support for enhanced police powers during COVID-19. So we were interested in understanding what specific powers the British public support and the underlying drivers of support for these powers. So to understand what factors might predict acceptance or rejection of granting police additional powers during the pandemic, we can look to research on police empowerment in non-pandemic times. So to empower police means to positively accept a development that grants police more power, including an acceptance of risk that this power may be misused. And previous research has explored predictors of support for police empowerment, including support for greater police autonomy and discretion, support for police militarization, including some research we did looking at the routine arming of police in Great Britain, support for police use of force, and support for police use of new technologies, such as live facial recognition. And this research has shown that public willingness to grant police extra powers is dependent on the extent to which people view the police as trustworthy and legitimate authorities. So when people feel the police exercise their authority in a fair and just manner, they are more likely to accept the right of the police to determine what's appropriate and acceptable, and are therefore more likely to support empowering police or granting them greater authority. So in other words, people support police empowerment because they generally believe police do the right things for the right reasons and that their actions are intrinsically good and appropriate. So in our research looking into live facial recognition, we found that Londoners who trusted the police and viewed them as legitimate were more likely to think police use of LFR was acceptable because they were reassured that this new power would be used in the correct way and not abused. We also found in that study that normative judgments about the police were much more important predictors of acceptance of LFR than instrumental concerns, such as concern about crime. So it seems that trust in the people being empowered is more important than the ends to which the new powers are oriented, such as a reduction in crime. So the research questions for the current analysis were: what powers do the public support? And what are the underlying drivers of support for police powers? And we looked at trust and legitimacy as potential drivers, along with some other variables relevant to the pandemic. So in our survey, participants were presented with this question. So below is a list of powers granted to police in the UK in order to help deal with the COVID-19 crisis, or which other countries have considered or already have in place. Can you tell me whether you support or oppose granting the police the following powers? And participants responded on a 5-point scale from strongly opposed to strongly support. And the data I'm going to present comes from the first wave of our panel study in April. So we presented participants with 6 potential powers, which covered 3 different areas. First, we had one item capturing the curbing of free expression. So participants were asked whether they supported or opposed making it a criminal offence to spread false information about contagious diseases. Second, we had 2 items measuring police enforcement of the regulations. So we asked whether people supported the police having the power to use an on-the-spot fine or to use force to make people return to their homes. And lastly, we had 3 items measuring surveillance of individuals. So we asked whether people were supportive of the use of drones, live facial recognition, and GPS tracking of mobile phones. So what powers do the public support? So on this chart, the pink part of the bar represents those who support or strongly support each power. And we found that participants in our study were the most supportive of the power curbing free expression. So 75% supported or strongly supported making it a criminal offence to spread false information. Slightly fewer, but still a majority of participants supported issuing on-the-spot fines. Use of force was less supported, with only 41% supporting the use of force against people. And we see that the surveillance powers had the lowest levels of support, with 30% supporting the use of drones and 21% each supporting the use of facial recognition and the tracking of mobile phones. But what are the underlying drivers of support for police powers? So I'm just going to present the explanatory variables we used in our analysis before going over the results. So consistent with previous research into police empowerment, we test whether trust in police drives support for police powers. And we measured two aspects of trust. The first was procedural justice, so whether people think their local police are fair and just in their decision-making and treat them with respect. We also measured bounded authority, so whether people think the police operate within appropriate boundaries and do not exceed their authority. So for example, the item, the police in my neighborhood get involved in situations they have no right to be in. We also test whether police legitimacy predicts support for police powers, and again we measured two aspects. The first was normative alignment, so whether people think the police act and behave in accordance with societally shared moral values. So the police stand up for values that are important for people like me. And the second aspect was duty to obey. So whether people feel a moral obligation to obey the police and grant them the right to dictate appropriate behavior. So for example, I believe it is my moral duty to support the decisions of police, even if I disagree with them. And we also measured two items related to COVID. So we had COVID-19 concern. So how concerned are you about getting COVID-19? And we also had expectations regarding the virus. So participants were asked, how long do you expect it will be until the coronavirus outbreak is over and things are back to normal in the UK? We also controlled for a range of demographic variables and personal experiences with both the pandemic and the police. So this is our model, and we use structural equation modeling to test for direct and indirect effects. And I realize there's a lot of arrows here, so I'll go through the findings step by step. So first, looking at legitimacy, we found that duty to obey had a strong and significant association with both support for enforcement and support for surveillance powers. Duty to obey also had a significant but weaker association with support for curbing free expression. Normative alignment, on the other hand, had a moderately strong and significant association with expression. Normative alignment had a weaker association with enforcement and no significant association with support for surveillance powers. So it seems that of the two legitimacy measures, duty to obey is the most important predictor of support for enforcement and surveillance powers. Normative alignment, on the other hand, is more important for predicting the curbs to free expression. So next, bringing in trust in police. We found little evidence that procedural justice or bounded authority had direct associations with support for police powers. However, both procedural justice and bounded authority were significant predictors of the two legitimacy measures. And we found significant indirect effects. So normative alignment significantly mediated the impact of procedural justice on expression. In other words, procedural justice had an indirect effect on expression, which was transmitted through normative alignment. We found that duty to obey significantly mediated the impact of both procedural justice and bounded authority on support for enforcement and surveillance powers. And these indirect effects implied that more than half of the impact of duty to obey was attributable to the downstream effects of procedural justice and respect for legal boundaries. Looking at our COVID-related predictors, we found that concern about the virus had significant associations with all three aspects of police powers. So people who were more concerned about the virus were more supportive of giving police new powers. But concern about COVID had a much smaller impact compared to police legitimacy. And lastly, we found that expectations about the timeframe to get back to normal had a weak but significant association with enforcement and expression. So people who thought the crisis would last longer were slightly more supportive of certain measures. So taken together, these findings indicate that police legitimacy had the primary influence on people's acceptance of increased police powers. In the case of police enforcement and surveillance, duty to obey the police was most important. So people who granted police the right to dictate appropriate behavior were more comfortable with giving police additional powers to enforce the legislation. For curbs on free expression, shared values and norms expressed by normative alignment were the most influential. And our expression item was related to how people felt about the public themselves violating social norms by spreading false information rather than actual police behaviour. So it makes sense that this item was more related to normative alignment. Next, although trust in police was not directly related to support for police powers, we found multiple indirect effects through legitimacy. So legitimacy transmitted the impact of procedural justice and bounded authority on support for police powers. And these findings are consistent with a lot of other research which supports the idea that legitimacy is rooted in people's direct and indirect contact with police officers, and particularly whether those officers act in respectful ways and make neutral and accountable decisions as they engage in everyday policing. So it seems that how police officers treat people has important implications for the acceptance or rejection of new police powers. Generating trust and legitimacy during the pandemic through a consistent, fair, and encouraging policing may mean people will be more likely to accept granting police additional powers, should that be necessary. So our findings lend support to the current consent-based model of enforcement as a last resort. And lastly, we found that concern about contracting the virus had a relatively small impact on support for police powers, which suggests that public support for police empowerment has a very strong normative basis, which is grounded in police legitimacy, while instrumental concerns such as concern about the virus only play a small role. So as I mentioned earlier in the talk, it seems that trust in the people being empowered, so in this case the police, is more important than the ends toward which the new powers are oriented. And in the next talk, Reika is going to talk more about instrumental concerns, and in particular, distinguishing between different types of fear of COVID-19. So what about now? So what approach the police will need to take during the second lockdown will partly depend on levels of compliance. So there's slightly less support for the lockdown this time around, and it's possible that fatigue might be more of an issue, particularly if the lockdown's extended past the 2nd of December. And also, as John mentioned, the rules are slightly less clear this time around. Added to this, as Arabella mentioned, the recent report by the Police Foundation found evidence of an enforcement gap, where the public might want to see the police enforcing the law more than they currently are. So there might be an increased demand for enforcement during the second lockdown. But our findings support the current 4E approach of light touch policing and enforcement as a last resort. If more enforcement is necessary, then it will be important for the police to exercise their powers in a consistent, fair, and encouraging manner. Because as we've shown, how officers treat people in their everyday interactions can have important consequences. And that is my talk. Thank you.